Alrighty, that beak is just blending right in there. So we're going to give it a different color. There, now it's yellow. Questioning the choice of the brush, but I think it's okay. It's a big chicken. Just like me. No, I'm kidding. You gotta joke. You gotta joke. Hello everybody, this is Glenda, and tonight I have got a fantabulous story for you. There was this old, we'll just call him geezer. I mean, that's what he was. But nobody had known where he came from. Nobody knew where he went. Well, we'll go back about 25 years. He had come upon, after he got back from the war, where he fought like any true soldier. He came home and nobody was there for him. It wasn't intentional. It just kind of happened that way. So he just started walking roads. And he walked down this one road. He saw this old, kind of beat up building, and he just kind of went over and looked at it. There were a couple chickens running around. That's all the life he saw. He looked for footprints. There weren't any. And he looked for signs of anything living other than the chickens. There was nothing there. Well, he thought, this old chicken coop ain't much, but it's summer. And I think I could make a night of it. He went in with an old rake he found laying around, and he cleaned all of the stuff out. And he found an old blanket off in a corner of the shed, or the coop. So he took it down to a river that wasn't very far away, and he washed it off, and he set a line in for some fish. He thought, well, maybe they'll get caught on the string. He hadn't had a hook. Well, wait a minute. He had a paper clip in his pocket. He tried to fashion a hook out of that. Tied it on the string and put it in the water. And then went back later and found, by golly, he caught a fish. So, with that fish and a better smell, well, kind of smelled like the river, but the blanket was warm and clean, somewhat, and dry, he was able to have a good night's sleep. Well, the next morning he decided, well, I'll walk on down the road. He saw some hills just loaded with a forest of trees along behind the coop. And he thought, well, I could take a nice walk through there. I might get lost. So I think I'll just keep on trucking down the road and see what I find. Well, he went on down the road and he found this little town. Very little town. And lady in the store said, well, where'd you come from? Oh, about anywhere, nowhere, he said. Well, that doesn't tell me much. He says, well, there ain't much to tell. That's about it. She says, well, I tell you what. Are you living here close? I could or couldn't, whichever you want. She was so puzzled. But she said, well, I need some help. here in my little store. He couldn't figure out just how much help she could need with hardly anybody around. She says, oh, they come around. People do come around. They come around when it's late and they're in from their fields. What I need is someone to help me help them. Oh, well, I can do that. And I can't pay much, but I don't need much. Well, she said, I'll pay you some, and I'll give you some food, some canned goods, and that kind of thing. Sure enough, sounds good to me. So that's what they plan to do. So he got busy to work, and she liked everything he did. He didn't seem to mind it so much. He thought, well, this keeps me busy, and I kind of like it that way. I feel kind of happy. So she says, well, here's your money, and here's your food. Can you come back tomorrow? He thought about staying in that old shed one more night. And he goes, sure, yeah, no problem. He could go home. He thought, funny, I've already thought home. Well, anyway, he could go back to this shed or chicken coop, whatever the thing was. And he asked for some matches. Oh, of course. So he took the matches and the canned goods, and he went, excuse me, he went back to the chicken coop. It really wasn't that long of a walk, but nobody ever seemed to come by there that he'd seen anyway. He never did see any tracks of any kind. There were things around, and he figured maybe one of these days he'd do some scouting, see what was around. But that night, he stacked some rocks up around it, kind of making a pit, put a few pieces of sticks in there, and he found a lid of some kind, to like an old garbage can or something. Put it upside down on top of that fire, took his can opener and opened a can of soup. You know, men traveling alone, they kind of have to carry can openers. Actually, it was a knife, but it worked. So he carried this here thing. And, hold on a minute. So he carried the knife. I goofed that up. Let me just goof that up and keep going. He heated up his soup right there in the can. And to cool it off, he added some water that he happened to have in a jug that she let him bring. It was just a jug of drinking water, so he was glad for that. So he had himself some soup for supper and a little bit of water, and he had some little bit of leftover soup. What could it hurt? He put it out there for the chickens, and they seemed to enjoy it. They just got to pecking the soup and drinking it. So they seemed happy. He was happy. He didn't mind if they shared his shed. It was actually their shed, so they were letting him share. So they had their little bench they'd set up on, and actually there were a few nesting places, few little nesting boxes. They've made their little nests, and they slept just fine in there. During the day, they ran around, ate some grass seed or whatever there was, and he'd go to town and he'd do whatever needed to be done. One day, she asked, is there anything else I can help you with besides food and water and some money? He said, well, I could use a couple of boards. Do you know where I could find some boards? Well, certainly. You can go down the street to the mill. He went down the street to the mill. The old guy says, well, certainly. How long do you need them? He said, oh, about this long and about this wide. Obviously, he wasn't a carpenter. But the miller, he knew how to mill about what he needed. So he cut him off a couple of pieces of board and gave him some nails and said, hey, do you have a hammer? He said, no, I sure don't. Can I buy one from you? The guy says, oh, heck, I've got dozens of them. Here, you can have this one. So he got a free hammer. And the boards cost him next to nothing. They were just some old ones that the guy had hanging around. So he took them back to the old coop. And he took those boards, and there was a big hole in the side of that thing. So he put them in a kind of a crisscross X fashion, and he covered that hole as best he could. He figured, well, a little breeze wasn't going to hurt. Besides, the roof, had a bunch of holes anyway. Well, this kind of kept going on for years at a time. And over time, the chickens, they just kind of got old. But then so did he. He kept working at that grocery store. The money he made, sooner or later, he bought himself some more clothes, some more boards, even some shingles. And he just kept fixing up that little old coop. One day he thought, I miss those old chickens. I miss the eggs he used to lay. So he went to town, and he asked the lady at the store, do you know where I can find me some chickens? Well, certainly, my kind sir. And he looks at her weird, and she says, oh, I'm just being goofy. Yes, I do know where you can get some chickens. So she told him where a farmer was up the road that he'd probably sell him a couple of chickens, which the old guy did. And they sat and chatted for a while. They'd both been in the war. But he didn't tell him where he was. He didn't tell him where he was, because he was afraid he was on somebody's private property, and they might just come after him. So he decided not to say anything. There was an old, very old-looking tractor. It was really just a small tractor. And there was a couple of those trash can lids still hanging around, kind of bent up. And he thought, I wonder if I put a rock in one of those to make it heavy and dented it around the rock. Would that plow a garden? He thought, well, ain't nobody to tell me it won't, so I'll just give it a try. And lo and behold, if that tractor didn't start. He didn't know where the gas came from. It had to have been in there for years, or else it was fresh, because gas doesn't usually hold that long. But he decided, well, we'll just go for it. And so he plowed him up a small garden. That plow he fixed up, it worked. In fact, he took a couple of pieces of angle iron he found hanging around, and he cobbled them onto there somehow with a bunch of tape, chewing gum. You know how the old saying goes. He found something that worked. He planted some ends of taters that he'd brought home, and he planted some bits of corn that he dried off the cob. He planted some seeds of tomatoes that he found, or that were left over. He dried his seeds out. He dried all his seeds out. And lo and behold, that next spring, that garden came up. And then he saved those seeds. The next spring, they came up even better because the soil was starting to get happy. If you know about happy soil, say, yeah, I know about happy soil. Well, that soil started to get happy because it had got some air and some nutrients. Actually, the nutrients came from the chickens, but we won't talk about that. So this old guy, he sat down one day and he just looked at his shed. And he looked at the place around it. He thought, look what I've done here. I'm sitting under a bunch of hills full of trees, just green all year round. And I finally shingled this old shed, and I even put some insulation in a few years back. I got those boards on the side replaced. So it's looking pretty good. Chickens still like it. I'm getting a little up there in age, but I can still take care of myself. And he just sat there and just kept thinking, this is getting pretty good. I hope nobody ever comes and chases me off this place. Well, then one day, he was digging through some old things that he'd never bothered with. Thank you for hanging around. And he just kept thinking, you know something? For coming back from the war and not having anybody and having nothing to my name and having nowheres to go, I've got a home. I've got friends. My house is all fixed up. It's small, but it's all fixed up. I even have a bed in there now. I got a couple of friends in town I get to go and chatter with. I've got a little river back here I can go do my laundry in. And I can catch me some fish. And the chickens are nice enough to lay me some eggs sometimes. Mostly every morning. I have got a good life. So he went into town one day. Well, he was going to work, but he knew one of these days it was going to get a little hard for him to keep on doing things. I mean, he wasn't that old, but he had kind of a hard life. The old lady running the store, she'd retired, and it was being run by a younger couple. And one day they just kind of decided, well, they didn't really need him anymore. They had it themselves. They could take care of it themselves. So he was out of a job. So he went to see the guy at the mill, and they sat and chatted. He says, I don't have a job anymore. The old guy says, what? Well, them kids, they bought that place. She retired. And I don't know, maybe I will too. He says, where have you been staying all these years? Well, I'd really rather not say. Ah, come on, old man. I'm your friend. You can tell me. No, there's this old road. Never seen anybody on it. But I found this old chicken shed. Over the years, I fixed it up. I got me a couple of chickens. We do pretty darn good out there. You're talking about the old Smith & Jones place. Oh, come on, Smith & Jones? Yeah. Couple of old robbers. They built that old shed out there out of practically nothing till the sheriff come and ran them off. Well, who does the land belong to? The old guy looks at him and says, as far as we can tell, it's yours. At least until you decide not to use it anymore. Well, if you won't tell anybody, I've fixed it up pretty good. I want to stay there. we'll just stay there till maybe someday you'll see I'm not around. You'll come out and you'll find my final resting place. I would be honored to do that for you. So that is it. That's the story. And you either like it or you don't. But that old guy, he's doing just fine. And so are the chickens.